Plague, 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 plague. Plague, 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 plague. Black plague, black plague, black plague. Today we are looking at the plague. It's part of chapter 14, section 4. You can see I split it into two sections for section 4. So we start with this image here. It's a rather ominous, scary looking image. What is this person's occupation? Well, if you know a little bit about the Black Plague, that is a doctor. And during this period, these doctors had these big masks on, and inside they had little bits of flour, which they thought kept the scent, of course, the rotten, bad scent of the bubonic plague away from them. But they also thought those flowers would protect them, and these masks would protect them from getting contained from the plague itself. They'd use these long sticks because they would try to avoid contact, because they realized at a certain point that sticks would help them avoid touching the victims. This was really important because a lot of plague doctors, in fact, did get infected and die, sometimes even before the patients themselves. The plague began when this type of bacteria known as Yersinia pestis was carried by fleas, which would latch onto rats, which eventually would transfer diseases on to human beings. It was around the 1400s when the plague made its way to Europe. It is believed to have started somewhere in China, and then through trade, it made its way eventually towards Europe, and it really spreads out once it hits Italy and starts to make its way into Europe by ocean and through various trades. And so there's quite a large estimate when it comes to what % of Europeans were killed by the plague. Some say as little as 25–30%, some say even more than half of all of Europe. And the reason why we have this big range is because many people were malnourished at the time, and it was hard to say how much of it was directly from the Black Plague and how much of it was from people not being able to farm, which meant people would starve and that would kill them. So then that begs the question, well, are they killed because of the Black Plague, or is that because they were starving? Now, numbers vary from anywhere from about 20 million to some historians citing as high as 80 million. So this map gives you an idea of the mid-1300s of how the virus spreads. You see it comes from western parts of Asia, and then eventually when it hits the Mediterranean Sea, that's when it really begins to spread all across Europe. Now, the symptoms of the Black Plague were especially nasty. Your fingers would get black, your toes get black, you get these chills, and you get these little bubonic lymph nodes getting swollen, and eventually you pass away. And some people died as quickly as within 24 hours of getting infected by the disease. Now, the plague did not only have effects in regards to the obvious effect of killing people, but it had various other negative consequences. For example, due to people being malnourished and being sick, farming was not good, which meant the economy was not good. People weren't getting enough food. Furthermore, it created this problem of false accusations. And the false accusations were against the Jewish people. The Jewish people at the time had better hygiene than the average European, and as a result, they were less affected by the plague in the beginning. Therefore, those who were affected would often accuse the Jewish people for purposefully spreading this deadly disease, and they were made as scapegoats. As a result of these false accusations, hundreds of Jewish communities were attacked and destroyed, and thousands of Jewish civilians died. This goes back to the death tally of the Black Plague. Again, the reason why there's such a variation among historians is, do we consider the death of these Jewish people part of the Black Plague, or do we not consider it? Again, there's a point on both sides to include it or not to include it in the death tally of the Black Plague. Now, a big part of why this plague was as nasty as it got was also the ignorance of the people. People had no idea why it was spreading, why it was happening. A lot of people attributed it to being God's punishment. And as a result, there were just various bogus methods in regards to trying to stop this plague. Some of these treatments would include things like placing frogs and leeches on the buboes. Other things would be like baking the infected areas, which obviously does not cure it. It just burns your skin. So there are dozens and dozens of effects the plague had, but the textbook likes to summarize it in half a dozen points, which I would like to go over right now. So we start with the obvious. The populations fall because people are dying. Secondly, trade declines and prices of goods rise. Thirdly, we begin to see serfs leave the manors. Number 4, we see nobles resisting higher wages, leading towards small revolts. So what's happening here is, due to the fact that many people are dying, especially the average peasant farmer is now asking nobles for more money for their work because they know they have more bargaining power. And the nobles initially did not want to give this extra money, and this led towards some revolts. Number 5, the Jews were falsely blamed. And finally 6, and this is very, very, very important because it connects on to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The church is beginning to lose its prestige. Why is the church losing its prestige? Well, because when people started getting sick at first, where did they go to? They went to the churches, they went to the priests, they tried to get help from God. And when God and the priests could not give them any help, people began to realize the church was perhaps not as powerful as they once thought it was. An interesting little side story in regards to the plague is this use of the plague victims by the Tatars. The Tatars were these nomadic fighters, and when they attacked the Genoese city of Kaffa, they would actually throw in dead bodies of plague victims to try to infect those who lived inside the city. In a sense, this was the first form of biological warfare we've ever seen. And of course, later on in history, we see biological warfare used in the form of mustard gas. And unfortunately, as recent as just a few decades ago, we still see biological warfare being used by the likes of Saddam Hussein. Now, I want to finish off with bringing it back to the 21st century. So plagues today. So plagues still occur, although not as prevalent as the one we're talking about right now around the world. And it occurs in places that are poor, places that don't have resources. So it's no surprise Africa seems to have the greatest problem.
The tiny island nation of Madagascar.
We see especially Madagascar suffering quite a bit of outbreaks of plague. Here's the copyright disclaimer under section 107. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.
It's so bright, strawberry champagne on us. Lucky for you, that's what I like. That's what I like. Lucky for you, that's what I like. That's what I like.